At 3:31 in the afternoon, Robert Monroe sat upright in his bedroom. This quiet environment served as the strict physical baseline for his upcoming field research. His immediate surroundings were defined by the technological constraints of the era. These heavy plastic telephones represented the upper limit of human connectivity, restricting communication to extremely narrow physical ranges. Monroe had spent weeks analyzing his relationship to this environment. He observed that human existence functions as a closed loop. We repeat the same actions, navigate the same conflicts, and eventually hit a ceiling, leaving little room for new learning. Monroe's field notes proposed a specific hypothesis, that if the physical cycle was indeed closed, then true evolution might eventually require moving beyond the biological frame altogether. Monroe detached his consciousness from his seated physical form. He drifted upward through the familiar room and immediately crossed into the absolute blackness of the astral void. In this deep space emptiness, he was met by his local guide, a glowing, highly intelligent entity he called an INSPEC. This guide introduced him to a vast, continuous stream of arriving consciousness, a network Monroe termed Layered Intelligence Forming Energy, or LIFE. Looking back toward Earth, Monroe observed a massive structural barrier surrounding the planet, a region known in the void as the Belief System Territories. This outer ring functions as a holding zone. It catches human minds immediately after physical death, keeping them locked in repeating cycles of violent emotion and suffering that serve no greater purpose. Monroe asked his guide a direct question. He wanted to observe a timeline where human civilization organized itself entirely differently, away from this endless friction. The guide agreed, shifting their coordinates. This next jump would act as a controlled phenomenological test to observe humanity operating at its absolute peak. The absolute blackness of the void dissolved into a turquoise sky. They hovered above a pristine, sweeping valley surrounded by snow-capped mountains, a location set roughly 1 million years in Earth's distant past. 2 million people inhabited the area, yet looking down through the thick canopy of trees, the air was completely clear of smoke or industry. The residents built their sleeping quarters and artisan workshops entirely underground, leaving the surface environment untouched. Monroe and his guide descended to observe the residents directly. Standing roughly 5 feet tall, they maintained perfectly healthy, disease-free bodies that appeared frozen at 30 years of age. They communicated telepathically, absorbing English instantly from Monroe's mind without ever moving their lips. Their harmony with the environment included mechanical mastery over local weather patterns. They summoned gentle afternoon thunderstorms at will, using a targeted lightning strike to nourish very specific patches of Earth. Traditional agriculture was entirely obsolete. A resident demonstrated their self-sufficiency by scooping a handful of dark soil and holding it in her palm. In a matter of seconds, the raw dirt transmuted directly into a perfectly formed ear of corn. They had eradicated sickness, injury, and death. Yet, despite achieving absolute physical perfection, the residents were preparing to abandon the physical realm forever. They had spent decades readying the local wildlife to survive without them, and their work was complete. The catalyst for their departure arrived a century earlier. They received a beacon they called the Signal, transmitted from the distant stars by a former resident who had ventured ahead to explore non-physical dimensions. They had explored the physical universe and found nothing they did not already possess. Biological immortality and total environmental mastery were simply the final milestones to pass before leaving the material world behind. Returning to the void, Monroe escalated his requests. He asked his guide to bypass human history entirely and initiate contact with a highly intelligent, non-human, non-physical entity. The guide accelerated rapidly until the space violently ruptured. The dark void was instantly replaced by a dense, suffocating geometric field of fiery neon orange light that pulled Monroe in and trapped his awareness. Instead of language, it transmitted a punishing binary pulse of electrical shocks. Monroe replied by projecting a map of our solar system with an arrow pointing from Earth. The entity answered aggressively, projecting a blazing stellar core with an arrow aimed into its center. Through these heavy binary exchanges, Monroe realized the entire orange field was merely a localized point of contact, a microscopic appendage of an organism stretching across the cosmos. The encounter suggested that physical life occupies a very narrow slice of a much larger ecosystem, one dominated by macroorganisms that operate independently of human understanding. The electrical beats accelerated into a chaotic buzz before snapping into total silence. Following a violent lurch, Monroe was abruptly ejected from the orange energy field and thrust safely back into the deep void alongside his guide. The contrast between the two non-physical intelligence types was immediate. Unlike the cold, alien scale of the cosmic Leviathan, the INSPEC guide possessed a warm, satirical sense of humor, a recognizable empathy that felt distinctly human. The data from these encounters solidified the core objective of Monroe's research. The trajectory of human consciousness appears to lead away from repairing the friction of Earth toward integration into these vast, layered intelligence networks. With the observation concluded, the INSPEC's light faded, and the void gave way to the familiar atmosphere of the bedroom. Monroe's awareness was pulled directly back to the spatial coordinates of his physical shell. A final check of the nightstand display confirmed his seamless reintegration, formally closing the timeline of the field expedition. Monroe's research suggests the physical world serves as a specialized, localized environment for early development, a starting point meant to be eventually outgrown.